of what is found in the case of this new patient. And this seems to me a terribly important message. Better to leave it alone if you can't do it right. To do them justice, I think analysts do seem sensitive to issues like that. So if we now ask the question, is there a science of psychoanalysis? The answer is no. What is called a psychoanalysis, that is to say what happens to NN, this anonymous analysand when psychoanalyzed, may not be scientific at all. But in quote-unquote successful cases, which may not be therapeutically successful, I'm now talking about theoretically successful cases, the analyst may succeed in establishing and representing in theoretical language the causal connections that hold within the complex structure of the patient's cognitive and emotional life. The reason psychoanalysis isn't the science Freud hoped for, and the reason it collapses so readily when attacked by people like Greenbaum, is that it has to be built afresh in every clinical encounter. It can't be offered whole to a curious world, except sometimes in exhaustive case studies. Almost every therapist knows of some cases in which there is something like what I call a science in this sense. That's to say, knows patients with respect to whom theoretical formulations really hold in the terms of that patient's behavior, much the way that a scientific account might hold. But every therapist knows perhaps of far more cases in which it didn't happen. It's quite rare, I suspect, psychoanalysis as a science in this sense. When it does happen, one can't know in advance that it will even look Freudian. But it turns out that one can often begin fruitfully with the provisional acceptance of some Freudian assumptions. And the fact that these are found helpful in clinical work is testimony, it seems to me, to Freud's insights. I had to do a response to Greenbaum's book, and what I thought of saying was that if Freud didn't provide the foundations of a science, because Greenbaum's book is called The Foundations of Psychoanalysis, he may at least be said to have provided the scaffolding for one. And I realized with astonishment, it must have been lodged in the back of my head somewhere, that Freud actually uses this image in an outline of psychoanalysis. And he says, we have to keep making hypotheses. These are not to be despised as evidence of embarrassment on our part, but deserve, on the contrary, to be appreciated as an enrichment of science. They can lay claim to the same value as approximations that belongs to the corresponding intellectual scaffolding found in other natural sciences, and we look forward to their being modified, corrected, and so on. Now, he's not talking about psychoanalysis in my sense, he's talking about it in general, but he's using this image of scaffolding, except that he goes on later in the same work to conclude that the work has actually been done and worked, and now it can be just like physics, which is, as I have tried to indicate earlier, something I just don't think will go. And it's really interesting that Freud doesn't at all consider the question that I've been talking about, which is the overriding complexity of the individual case. He does say, well, actually, there is a lack of agreement among analysts, but the novelty of the problem is to blame for this, that is to say, lack of training. But there is, besides this, a special factor inherent in the subject itself, for in psychology, unlike physics, we're not always concerned with things which can only arouse a cool scientific interest. Thus, we shall not be very greatly surprised if a woman analyst who has not been sufficiently convinced of the intensity of her own wish for a penis also fails to attach proper importance to that factor in her patients. But such sources of error arising from the personal equation have no great importance in the long run. I put that in only just to, indicate quite obliquely the fact that I'm aware of some of the ways in which Freud offends in his work. And the thing is that this notion, lack of training, lack of emotional neutrality, I don't think is where the essential difference lies. And it isn't just in the complexity either, because if you had a super computer, the complexity wouldn't matter. It is in the complexity, though, in the sense that, I would be inclined to say, that you can have uninspired physics, and it won't do any harm. What Kuhn calls normal science, for example. But I don't think you can have uninspired psychoanalysis without the risk of doing harm. Because how well an analyst builds on the scaffolding that Freud's provided in constructing the theory I've been talking about depends on his or her methodological skill and on the flair for cases. And if an analyst starts with the view that psychoanalysis is already a science and just learns it like physics, then that analyst isn't likely to be flexible enough to do it well, and will in fact almost certainly do a lot of damage. On the other hand, if an analyst is persistent and persevering enough to construct the science of the patient in the way I've suggested, this may often be rewarded. constructing such a science for the patient is perhaps the ultimate fulfillment of the Delphic injunction to know oneself. And there's nothing wrong with anybody going about it that way, although, as a very final remark, I will say that it remains a personal, but sometimes a social judgment, whether the world of the patient is worth the investigative resources it takes, where self-knowledge becomes self-indulgence. But that's another story. Thank you.
Professor Caws will be willing, if not happy, to answer questions. Tom?
I'm not sure if I understood one point you were making. If your point is science in one sense, it won't go. How can it go in the other usual sense? That is, when the analyst goes to do the science of implementation, there are certain notions that he's bringing with him. Attempts to offer coherent accounts of the processes of persons, repression, the unconscious, slip, participation, obsession, or something. These would seem to be precisely the kind of thing somebody like Milgram is calling.
Yeah, well, that's what I tried to say, that we can't be sure it'll look Freudian. It's interesting that analysts who bring to their patients this kind of training often do find themselves able to locate such things. But my point was that you can't bring them and expect them to go a priori. They'll only be shortcuts. And one of the most honest things an analyst may be called upon to do, as it were, is to jump all that. Because in this case, just the patient work of, I mean, that's not a joke, but the persevering work of getting the patient to churn up evidence. I mean, I'm really quite serious about why it takes a long time, for example, because if you go to a new world, you have to start looking around. You don't know what you're seeing yet. You've got no categories necessarily. And although there are certain things, there can be interventive therapy of one kind or another. You could do that with Freudian categories or not. And if it turned out that somebody didn't cry all the time or something, that would be wonderful. That would be merely therapy. There's nothing particularly theoretical about that. As I said, very often you'll have what even might look like a successful psychoanalysis that doesn't involve the construction of any science at all, in the sense in which it's just a bag of tricks. But what I'm saying is that it is at least conceivable to me that in some cases, and people I know who do this kind of work have testified to there being some cases, in which things start to hang together, not necessarily in the way that Freud would have anticipated, but you listen for a long time, and you get people to produce. After all, you don't necessarily have to assume a Freudian unconscious, but there's certainly stuff coming out that you aren't going to get unless the patient is, let's say, pre-associating or recounting dreams or something of that kind. And you amass stuff for a long time, and it perhaps doesn't make any sense in any term. See, the risk, it seems to me, and this is a risk which is not only run, but as it were, succumbed to gravely by many people who practice psychoanalysis, I think, is of jumping right away on some dream interpretation or some parallel with the ideology of some other case or something like that, and making what I call these trans-world generalizations. And if an analyst is patient enough to resist that line, then it may turn out, after a lot of work, that there are some classes of evidence, for example, coming from perhaps different quarters. And there are some tentative generalizations that can be made that test against against other features of the patient's own report, and so on. So I agree with you entirely that if you come with the metapsychology, or even with the details of the clinical theory, you're likely to suppress, overlook, go wrong. It isn't that even so. Suppose psychoanalysis is the science of the idiosyncratic world of individual patients, and suppose you do 1 million of them. It wouldn't be at all surprising if there were some pretty striking parallels between them, after all, in spite of the 30 billion neurons. But no, go ahead.
But if you eliminate the possibility, if you don't import metapsychology, you may not have a term, you don't import notions of the unconscious repression. You may not have a kind of term already for what you're likely to do when you're doing biography.
Well, I think, biography, like history, seems to me to be, in fact, nothing more than a kind of protocol for the social sciences. When people talk about learning the lessons of history, I always think they really ought to say learning the lessons of the social sciences that you get by using historical evidence. Of course, it's biography, yes, and that's what Northrop used to, FSC Northrop, I don't know if anybody reads him anymore, but he used to talk about what he called the natural history stage of science. Natural history stage of science is just gathering stuff, And as you gather the patient's material, that's the patient's biography for sure. Maybe that's as far as it'll go, But what I'm suggesting is if there is to be a science of psychoanalysis without running into some of these difficulties, the kind of science it would have to be, I think, is what I'm describing as the science of the idiosyncratic world of the individual. Yes. Oh, sorry.
I'm not a philosopher, though I have some knowledge of Freud. It seems to me that what I get out of this is that we're almost getting to the point where we could sort of draw a parallel between what you think could be a science of psychoanalysis and, on the one hand, and the science of individual falling rocks. I mean, the science of this falling rock, the science of that falling rock, the science of that falling building, and which seems to me to be, contrary to the whole point of science, which is to generalize on the basis of a theory. And I find it odd that you should start with Freud and quote nothing but Freud, which is, after all, such a dogmatic edifice, and then go on to say that if there's going to be a psychoanalysis at all, it's going to have nothing to do with Freud. In that sense, why not forget Freud and do what analysts have been doing the past 10 or 15 years and look at some of the schools that claim to be psychoanalytic schools but really don't read Freud anymore?
Yeah, well, I'm perfectly willing to do that. This paper, I'm going backwards at your question, because when you've picked up and over-exaggerated some things I had already exaggerated, so that makes it, so what I want to do is to bring you down a little bit. But to the last question, I'd say sure. This paper really arose out of my reading of Greenbaum and responding to him in a much, much shorter version of it. And since he takes, different people have different nomenclatures in this respect. Some people think psychoanalysis is just what Freud did, and other things should have different names. Other people think that psychoanalysis is something much broader, and Freud is just an early and rather, pioneering psychoanalyst, and so on. And I don't think that matters one way or the other terribly much. I would want to say that whatever other school you might find is probably also quite helpfully regarded in the light that I've suggested. But it is not at all the same as the science of this rock and that rock. You see, it would be, as I said, we had a supercomputer. If you would really say, look, it's like some incredibly devious chess game or something of that kind. What are all the possibilities for 30 billion neurons in this case? Here's this body, and it's not body and brain. The brain is part of it. It goes through the world, and every few seconds the scene changes, and the scene is of a certain complexity, and it gets processed in this extraordinary complex way. And in principle, if you had some sort of super Laplacian computer, but it would really have to be, the information processing of the computer would have to be sort of greater by several orders of magnitude than the known contents of the universe, then you could figure it out. And then it would be like the science of all the rocks. What I'm saying is, if you had rocks which were wayward in some completely unpredictable sense, then you'd have to look at them, as it were, one by one, to take account of this waywardness. And the reason why I take it, it makes a certain amount of sense to look at an individual as a world is not only the kind of metaphysical point I was making about the world being in fact a function of the individual. As I said, there's no world, there's no known world. I'm not talking about what world there may be or might be if there were none of us or something of that kind. There's no known world, no mathematical structure, no structure, no theoretical structure anywhere that is actually apprehended by anybody that sort of isn't within that person's capacity, which is again this sort of tautology that I take to be profound, although you may take it to be trivial. I don't think it is. It is trivial. Given that each one of us is in a sense as complex as the world, because we have to match the world, and that's the only world we have, then what I'm suggesting is that if we want to investigate ourselves, we may have to devote as much in the way of time and resources and imagination to doing that as we would have to do in the investigation of the world itself. In the world, there are lots of people, and if you want to treat them like rocks, that's okay. And as I said, given that you're prepared to do this anonymously and schematically, there are lots of interesting ways of treating people like rocks. And they will behave in predictable ways in supermarkets and universities and things of that kind, and they'll fall under Gaussian curves and all that. So that's perfectly fine. No problem about that. But of course, it's not much help psychoanalytically to be told that you're one of the 20 potential suicides or something of that kind, you know. So that if you're really going to do psychoanalytic work, you have to take these things as idiosyncratic.
But can I just
Yeah.
add the last thing? That is the science, the psychoanalysis, the way you envisage it, not psychoanalysis, somewhat like getting to know Peter Caws by meeting him 4 times a week and knowing him well enough that I'll be able to tell that his behavior is inconsistent with previous behavior. So that, in other words, by simply using my common sense and being moderately intelligent and knowing you after 4 or 5 years of meeting you 4 times a week, am I not, in effect, applying the science of lay psychoanalysis?
Well, I mean, I suppose. The thing is, I might say that you learn physics the same way, you know, by watching your kettle boil and falling downstairs and things of that kind. And after 5 years of doing that, you'll know physics. I don't think you'll know physics any more that way than you'll know psychoanalysis by meeting me 4 times a week with your common sense approach. I'm not saying you have to have a Freudian. One of the things that strikes me as intriguing about the actual analysts that I've met is that some of them do seem to be able, quite independently of doctrinal commitments to Freud or anything else, to come up with tremendously insightful conjectures, which turn out to very, very often to work out in the subsequent history of the patient's life. At least, I mean, just judging on case material. I mean, I've never done this work myself. And that this seems to be not just a lay acquaintance, a casual acquaintance with the patient, but a very carefully observing and sort of hypothesis-forming acquaintance. And that there should be a continuum between your casual meeting of me 4 times a week and what somebody with a kind of flair for analytic work who's really done a tremendous amount of training and reading and that kind of thing, not just in order to apply in some Procrustean way or some unimaginative way a preformed doctrine, but in order to have the kind of flexibility that will in fact observe the idiosyncratic features of the world in question. There should be continuum between those. Doesn't seem to me at all surprising, just as it wouldn't be surprising that some people have just a gut feeling about falling bodies and others can measure their acceleration. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question about the same topic. I think you're trying to be charitable to Freud and think that Greenbaum, you're trying to say somehow something out of psychoanalysis. You're saying that Greenbaum has successfully convinced us that there is no science for psychoanalysis. However, we could solve this situation by pushing the area a little bit, by isolating it and calling it onto the individual. But I don't see how you could say for it this way, and what sort of science you were telling us about, and why do we not call it just individual acquaintance and study of the person, which would take a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or a few days. The criterion with which you determine that sort of science with a success is the individual is cured, the patient is cured. But if I understand Greenbaum correctly, he's saying, well, the success is not to be counted as a criterion. Maybe success.
No, I agree with that.
Successfully.
I agree with that. Yeah.
But beyond that, I don't see how you could give us any generalization that would be considered scientific from studying an individual.
Well, I mean, you're right that it is in a certain way the same question. It's back to the old biography question. I'm not really trying to save Freud. I think Freud was an astonishingly imaginative and creative person and so on. I mean, I think that there is something tremendously plausible about some of the ways, even in the project, and not to mention in the other parts of the psychology. But at the same time, I have no particular vested interest in, Freudian psychoanalysis as having a better scientific status than it in fact has. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to me to be just sort of a last-ditch desperation kind of thing that I'm trying to do with this line of thought that emerges historically out of Freud and his followers, because it seems to me that even Freud himself has some striking successes in particular cases where he doesn't just come to therapeutic closure. In fact, sometimes he doesn't come to therapeutic closure at all. But he does come to what I would want to call genuine theoretical understanding of the case in question. And I think that's true of other therapists, some of whom I've read and some of whom I've talked to. But they aren't very frequent, perhaps. My sense is, you see, and I attach perhaps as much importance to this notion of the equipollence, if you like, of subject and world that I came to towards the end of the paper, partly because of the naive but I think true observation that there's no known world more complex than the subject is capable of carrying. So I want to suggest that science being not quite the tight affair that Greenbaum makes it out to be, but this, relatively speaking, more modest creating of a fiction which proves to match in certain specifiable respects some features of the world, that it's quite reasonable for somebody to go into analysis, whether self-analysis or analysis with an analyst, expecting to come out with some kind of self-understanding of this sort. As I say, to do it thoroughly would take such resources of time and patience in the other sense for the CE that one has to ask the question, is this what you want to spend your life doing? I mean, maybe you want to settle for something merely therapeutic. But what I'm saying is I think the theoretical is there. And then every now and then one comes across in the literature, especially in the technical literature in psychiatry, striking cases of extraordinarily bizarre kinds in which you can see, look, I mean, a set of connections was discovered in this particular case, which holds up and which are predictive, not in tremendously generalizable ways. I mean, you see, physics is, I can say pretty exactly what will happen if I throw something sort of anywhere near the surface of the Earth and so on. You can't do that kind of thing. But that there's the elements that are in place have the marks, I would want to say, of genuine scientific theory.
My question relates to the first question you were asked, I think, and it has to do with two of the examples that you used. One which is an example, it's Lydia's Caws, the woodpecker and the frustrating tooth. And the other example is the people traveling in that rocket that travels through infinity. Theoretically, they should get it.
Well, they get to another world. That's
Yes, assuming that they do, and you were assuming that they did. You said they would have no categories to find out, to explain, or to know what it is that they're seeing. And then you present psychoanalysis as you presented that, you gave that example as a metaphor for psychoanalysis and the kind of science psychoanalysis. The problem I have with your presentation is trying to determine the kinds of starting points that you put in. At times, it seems to me, with the example of the rocket, and I think the reason the two examples struck me, I think, is because, in some sense, to me, they're mutually exclusive.
You mean the Levi-Strauss and the, yeah.
And what strikes me is that at times, it struck me that what you seem to be assuming is a kind of tabula rasa of the analyst and the analysis, and the mind as a tabula rasa. And the other raises the kind of question: what kind of a world is it that can establish a connection between a woodpecker, beak, and the vegetarian tooth? What kind of a world is it that allows men who renews all of social science on the basis of that example to make his fortune, to make a career out of it?
Yeah.
See, I mean, it seems to me that it doesn't happen in a void, and yet it
No, I
seems
think
to
you're
be
quite
saying
right.
both things, that it happens in a void and that it doesn't happen.
Well, and I actually used the Levi-Strauss quote only in order to characterize a certain kind of science that I said psychoanalysis might be, but that Freud certainly would have rejected. I did want to use this notion of common interpretative structures as emerging sort of post the genetic and epigenetic diversity as a way of explaining why that model of the social sciences will work in some cases. But I didn't want to say it would work in the case of psychoanalysis, although it might in a micro kind of way. This notion of the what comes into the preconscious in linguistic form being in a way an interpretative version of something chaotic in the unconscious or something like that. So I mean, I don't really think. I don't see the connection between the two cases, but the Infinity Rocket case, I suppose I quoted only because I like Jose Benedetti's book so much, and I mean, it's one of the funniest philosophy books I've ever read, and I certainly recommend it to you. It's just called Infinity, and he has all the infinity machines, like, how easy, if you want to count to infinity, it's very easy. You take a piece of paper, you divide it in two, you write 1, you write the next bit in 2 and write 2, and then the next bit in 2 and write 3, and by the time you get to the corner, you've written down all the numbers. I mean, it's perfectly simple. And the Infinity Rocket is just that, going towards the large instead of going towards the small. I use that as as sort of imagining what would the philosophy of science be like, and what would training in the philosophy of science be like, or what would training in scientific methodology be like if what you were going to do with the people so trained was to put them in an Infinity Rocket and send them to somewhere where they wouldn't recognize anything. Now, two things are to be said. One is that they take themselves with them, so they carry with them all this stuff that I'm suggesting the analyst can't help carrying into the office when the new patient comes in. But secondly, the world when they get there is going to be complex in some way, we're assuming. Obviously, that's hyperbole. I mean, I don't mean that the patient is that different, because after all, 30 billion neurons is a very small number under certain aspects, although under certain other aspects a rather large one. And I certainly don't mean to say either the analyst or the analysand is a tabula rasa. The analysand is full of stuff, full of complexity, starts talking right away, The analyst brings all this stuff to bear. The analyst has got to hold back, not too quickly to apply the criteria of the world he comes from, or she comes from, because that way you're likely to overwhelm and overinterpret and so on. But the analysand just has the job of churning stuff out until it begins to make some sense to the analyst, until it makes the basis for certain kinds of theoretical conjectures. This may take a very, very long time. And indeed, Freud points out, if the stuff is too disorganized, you can't do it at all. That's why he says you can't treat psychotics, There's got to be some sort of degree of order. The question is what sort of order, and that's where I want to use the New World analogy. We don't know what sort of order. We don't know what the rules of connection are. And we can't assume that they're going to be rules of connection of a certain sort.
Could I have just one more question, and then I think the rest of it will be more informal then.
Okay.
I find myself caught in a certain circularity. I'm not sure what you mean by the aims of psychoanalysis. You use the term cure, you use the word success, you use the term bringing the unconscious to the conscious, you used the term self-understanding. You talked about Galileo and a theory that fits. Now, ultimately, is your position that at the end of an analysis, the analysand's perception of himself, his self-understanding, fits the analyst's perception of his inner reality?
No. Well, but before I say no right away because it works with either case, but which did you mean, his inner reality, the analyst's inner reality or the analysand's inner reality?
Does talk about self-understanding,
Yeah.
did you mean that that fits the analyst's perception of the patient's inner
No, I don't think it matters what the analyst thinks.
And
In this particular
how
case.
do they know whether he's cured?
No, no, but look, first of all, I don't think I used the word cure. If I did, I'm sorry. I might talk about therapeutic success and saying how would therapeutic success be measured? Presumably by the relief of symptoms, you know, and that's, you know, that could happen for any sort. You could take a pill, you know, and actually one of the, when I've given a few times a seminar on philosophy and psychoanalysis, and there are nearly always analysts in the seminar, and they split right down the middle about whether they'd take the pill or not, or whether they'd recommend it. That's to say, if you could have, you know, a precisely engineered chemical thing that fit just the situation of your neurons, you know, so that it would just, you know, all the symptoms would disappear and you'd be happy. It's like the old thing of psychosurgery, lobotomies and things. Would you have the operation or would you take the pill? And half of them say yes and half of them say no, and I always find that really very interesting. It's quite contrary intuition. But what I'm talking about, the only thing I'm talking about in this paper, I'm not talking about therapeutic success. I suspect that if, and that's the reason I went through some of that stuff at the beginning, if Kant is right in his essay on the old saw, that all theory is useful in practice, all true theory is useful in practice, then I suspect that genuine self-understanding on the part of anybody who went through this process would in fact result in some sort of practical improvement, assuming that that was something that was desired in the first place. But the only thing I've been talking about is psychoanalysis as a science, that is, as a means of giving a theoretical account of a domain in some world, which fits in the sense that you can feed in things that happen in that world to this theoretical account and get out some kind of enlightenment. I don't want to say prediction. In physics it would be prediction, and in psychoanalysis probably not. Some kind of coherence as an account of what's going on. At the end of the process, I take it, would be that the patient, who would, in my understanding of the matter, have become thereby an agent, that's to say would no longer be in the passive position but would assume an active position, would know enough about him or herself to be able to anticipate, because of this theoretical understanding, things that were likely to crop up behaviorally, and thereby avoid all sorts of, you know, it's just a form of self-knowledge, that's what I said. Of course it can exist on an informal level, as was suggested by, I mean, you know, having lived with oneself for somewhat more than 4 hours a week for many years, normally one would expect to come upon, to have come upon some form of self-knowledge, although of course part of what the whole story of psychoanalysis is about is how unlikely it is under certain circumstances that people will in fact acquire that self-knowledge. That's where the theory of repression comes in, but I mean, you don't have to take it in its Freudian form even there. So it has nothing to do with what the analyst thinks. It has to do with the matching, as it were, of the theoretical account with the behavioral evidence. And the patient is going to have to be a bit sort of methodologically reflective to be able to convince him or herself that this is in fact happening. It may, of course, be helpful if the analyst says, good for you, and gives him an A or something like that, but I mean, that's not really the issue. It isn't what the analyst thinks, it's what happens to the patient.
Doesn't that bring us to the pretty, when is the analysis terminable? You mentioned Roustan earlier. Were you talking about Roustan who wrote Dire Mastery? When is the pick? When?
Not Roustan, but Rostand. R-O-S-T-A-N-D.
Well,
Yeah.
Roustan,
Yeah.
his whole argument is that the patient and the analyst seldom agree when that patient is ready to walk out the door.
No, I'm sure that's right. I mean, I think this hardly ever happens, what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is, if you want a meaning for the expression psychoanalysis as a science, what it's got to be the science of, which is the title of my lecture, is a world of, an idiosyncratic world of an individual subject, because you aren't going to make it if you want these cross-world generalizations, for various reasons, some of which Greenbaum abuses. It's not that you couldn't make it in terms of cross-world generalizations, except that they'd have to be expressed in terms of such complexity that it would no longer look like any science of ordinary human behavior. I mean, you'd have to be specifying orders of firings of billions of neurons and things like that, and that, you know, that wouldn't be what we normally mean by psychoanalysis. The fact that in practice there's disagreement about when to terminate, that in practice people sometimes leave even unhappier than they came in, that in practice it's a horrendous waste of time and money. I mean, all of that may be perfectly true, but that's not what I was talking
I can see that the discussion could be completely open-ended, so therefore we'll just terminate it here, I think, and maybe defer it till tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock for the next lecture. Thank you.